This evening's discussion: can we remove dams and have a clean and reliable and affordable energy system in the Pacific Northwest? This evening, we'll discuss the intersection of clean energy and wild salmon in the Columbia Basin with Sean O'Leary, the Northwest Energy Coalition's Communications Director. Sean is a close colleague and friend, and I'm honored that he could join us this evening. Sean joined the Northwest Energy Coalition in 2016. NWEC works to develop and enact policies to assist the Northwest electric system transition in ways that are affordable and support the expansion of new clean energy resources. They're an excellent organization. I've worked with them for many years and have tremendous admiration and respect. Their efforts, in combination with others, among other things, include the replacement of the power and grid services currently provided by the 4 Lower Snake River dams. Prior to joining the coalition, Sean was the author of The State of My State, a blog and newspaper column and book that explored environmental and economic and energy issues in his home state of West Virginia, a place quite different than Washington State. Sean is also a playwright with half a dozen professionally produced plays to his credit. Sean's a wonderful man, a Renaissance man, and it's an honor to have you with us this evening. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you, Joseph. Should I proceed?
You can jump in.
Okay. I'm going to share screen, so please, if everyone could just confirm for me that you can see the cover of the presentation. Okay.
Looks good, Sean.
Okay, very good. Well, first, before I get into the presentation, I really want to thank you, Joseph, and everyone at Save Our Wild Salmon, for this opportunity, because although we're called the Northwest Energy Coalition, and it may not be obvious to everyone that preserving the environment and pursuing environmental goals is central to our mission, it in fact is. It's actually written into our charter. And for us, for the last many years, this particular issue, the restoration of salmon populations, the restoration or at least preservation of other species, has been our foremost issue on which we've focused. And we're frankly proud and flattered that we have the opportunity to work on this issue. So thank you, Joseph. Thank you, everyone at SOS and everyone else who's here for allowing us to be part of this. What we're going to talk about tonight is, whoops, I'm sorry. I'm trying to advance the presentation and it's not advancing. Hold on just a moment. There we go. What we're going to talk about tonight is the challenge of replacing power from the dams reliably and affordably, and especially to be able to do so with little or no increase in gas emissions. And the reason that we're having this discussion tonight is because, of course, the recent DEIS draft came out, and in doing so, it overstated, we think, pretty significantly the costs associated with power replacement. And so I'd like to take you a little bit through why we think that's the case, and finally, what we can do about it to get back on track. And so what I'd like to do is take you back in time for a moment to April of 2018, when the Northwest Energy Coalition commissioned a study to specifically look at power replacement. And that study was a full operational study of the way in which the dams work in the context of the overall Northwest energy system. And the key finding of the study was that we can, in fact, remove the dams and replace the power they provide with a portfolio of conservation of new renewable energy resources like wind and solar, and we can do it while maintaining grid and transmission reliability at levels that are equal to or even better than the current system. And you'll see the actual quantitative evidence of that in a moment, but also that we can do it without increasing greenhouse gas emissions. And in summary, we also calculated that it could be done at a cost of about an average cost of about $1.38 per month for the average Northwest residential customer. And we'll come back to that number too. But I think that $1.38 per month pretty well meets the objective of being able to do this affordably. I think most of us would be willing to spend that much in order to restore salmon and steelhead populations and achieve all the other benefits that would come about as a result of restoring the lower Snake River. Just a few things about the study. First, I want to emphasize that it is a full technical study of the dams that was done for the express purpose of assessing whether the power could be replaced with a portfolio of new resources. And to do that, we conducted the study in 3 phases. The first one was that we identified and quantified the grid services provided by the dams. In other words, we had to understand what the dams actually do. Then secondly, we developed a series of hypothetical replacement portfolios, and we'll talk about those in just a moment, and portfolios specifically that would meet or exceed both the reliability and energy needs of the Northwest. And then finally, the challenge was, okay, how much does that cost? How much does it cost both financially? What are the implications in terms of emissions? And then finally, to conduct the study, we went out and hired a consulting firm, Energy Strategies, based in Salt Lake City, because they are a firm that does energy resource assessment and planning for utilities and other organizations. In fact, this, and we'll talk about this some more as well, because it's a significant issue with respect to how the DEIS is conducted. Energy Strategies is a company that does integrated resource planning, which is what we're talking about. And in a few minutes, I'll explain exactly what that means and compare it to what the folks who conducted the DEIS assessment did. And so what the first lesson that we learned when Energy Strategies conducted the study and assessed the role the dams play is that, in fact, the dams do actually matter in the provision of electricity to the Northwest. Specifically, removing the dams without replacing the power and the grid services they provide would elevate the risk of service interruptions to unacceptable levels. And very quickly, I can explain that. If you look at the chart on the left that's titled Probability of Service Curtailments, you'll see a scale on the left-hand side, which is the percent loss of load probability. That's another way of saying it's the probability that at some point in a given year, the demand for electricity will exceed the available resources. And with the dams in place, where you see that stripe-filled column, you'll notice that at the time we conducted the study, the regional loss of load probability was about 3.5%. And that is within the allowable standard that is published by the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, which sets standards for these things. That is what that body exists to do, is to make sure that utilities around the region are meeting their obligations for reliability. And the council sets the standard at 5%. And so again, what we're saying is that right now, with the dams in place, there's about a 3.5% probability that at some point in any given year, we could have a situation where the demand for electricity exceeds the available supply, which would result at some point in the system with brownouts or perhaps even blackouts if it were to happen. And if you take the dams away, then in the blue column, you see that the loss of load probability goes all the way from 3.5% to 8%, which is in excess, obviously, of the standard that has been set by the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. And I would add that, you know, were it not for that fact, were it not for the fact that the loss of load probability exceeded 5%, then we would be having a very different conversation, because then it might not be necessary to replace the power from the dams. They could simply be removed and we could get on with life. But because the loss of load probability is as high as it is without the dams, that's why we're having this discussion. And so, having made that assessment, we knew both that the power from the dams had to be replaced, and we also had an idea of how much power has to be replaced. And so to do that, we considered 3 different approaches. One of those, the one on the left, called energy efficiency and demand response, was an exercise in which we asked ourselves, could we replace the power from the dams without actually creating any new generation resources, without any more wind, without any solar? Could we do it just by becoming more energy efficient? And demand response is a fancy term, but basically it means balancing out our demand for power so that the spikes when we need power the most are not as high and the lulls are not as low. And so we looked at a couple of scenarios in which we tried to meet the need without doing any generation. We also looked at the question of, okay, well, what would happen if we replaced power from the dams with natural gas, or fracked gas, as some of us prefer to refer to it. And we looked at the cost and, of course, the emissions implications of that. And then finally, we looked at another set of portfolios that we referred to as the balanced portfolio, because it's comprised of a combination of different elements, including wind power, solar power, storage, and also, of course, energy efficiency, demand response, and hydro. And what we ended up developing was a series of different portfolios. And real quickly, I'll describe for you the chart, which shows across the top, you'll see the word replacement portfolios. And under replacement portfolios, you'll see NGA, which is non-generating. That's the one where we do it entirely with energy efficiency. You then see another replacement portfolio to the right of that called balanced, and then one paired with it, balanced plus. That's the one where we do it with a combination of wind, solar, energy efficiency, and demand response. And then to the right, you'll see all gas. And underneath each of those headings, you see that we have listed demand side resources, meaning with energy efficiency and demand response, things that could be done to reduce the need for additional energy. We also do it with resource side, meaning the addition of wind and solar or natural gas. And then finally, capacity market, meaning that in some cases we might not meet the need by building new resources, but we could go out to the wholesale markets and buy some from other parts of the country. And so that was the basic range that we looked at to assess the different options available to us. We also, though, if you look to the right in where the orange heading is, we also were doing the study at a time where the Northwest, principally Oregon and Washington, were considering policy changes that would alter the rules under which utilities have to operate with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. And so we also considered, well, what would happen if the states of Washington and Oregon implemented some restrictions that might alter the ways in which utilities have to plan. And so there's that entire range of options that we looked at. And what happened was, when we looked at it, we were considering how each of those portfolios would operate with respect to, again, reliability, carbon emissions, and also ultimately cost. And what we found out was that if you look at the charts below, you'll see to the left the probability of curtailments. This is actually an expansion of the chart we were looking at before. So again, you see the loss of load probability with the dams at the far left at about 3.5%. And then you see the blue column, which represents what would happen if the dams were removed. And of course, the loss of load probability goes to 8%. Then to the right of those, you'll notice the different portfolios I just talked about. And moreover, what you'll notice about the replacement portfolios is that every one of them comes in with a lower risk of losing power than not only a lower level than is required by the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, but it's also lower than the service level currently provided by the dams. And so with that finding, we determined that yes, indeed, the power from the dams can be replaced, and it can be done not only reliably, but actually with an improvement in the level of reliability in which we operate. And that's an important finding, because what it means is that as we talk about what are the options available to us as a region, we know that when we talk about power replacement, we don't have to worry, frankly, about brownouts or blackouts or any of the other boogeymen that have been held out by some opponents of dam removal. That it's not a matter of whether we can or we can't replace the power. It's only a question of how much it will cost. And so that being the case, the next question was, well, okay, but what happens with carbon emissions if we do this? And we looked again at each of the portfolios to see what would happen. And so, for instance, in the chart to the right, you'll notice down at the bottom, we have the two all gas portfolios. And indeed, if you look to the far right-hand column, you see that, for instance, the basic all gas portfolio makes the region's carbon emissions rise by nearly 8%, which is a pretty darn significant bump. But then if you look up at the top and you look particularly at the balanced plus portfolio, and you'll see in a moment, the reason that I'm concentrating on that one is that it also turned out to be the most cost effective. You'll notice that carbon emissions only increase by about 1% or less. And the only reason that they increase at all, frankly, is because there is a chance that utilities could, on some occasions, go out of the region to purchase electricity from wholesale markets over which we don't have control. But it's also the case that, of course, if at the time the region passed energy policies that prohibited utilities from doing that, then you see that in the row below balanced plus, you see that balanced plus greenhouse gas policy actually would result in a 2% reduction in overall carbon emissions. So the point is, we had already determined that the power from the dams could be replaced affordably. We now know it can be done also without a significant increase in greenhouse gas emissions. And so that brings us really to kind of the crux of the problem, which is, okay, cool, how much is it going to cost us? And this chart summarizes that. Again, you see the various replacement portfolios arrayed across the top. And then you see down the left-hand column, the left-hand matrix, you'll see we calculated the total annual cost of replacement in millions of dollars per year, the percent change in revenue that would be required to pay for those changes, and then also, finally, what the effect on the average monthly bill would be. And so, for instance, if you go to the preferred balanced plus replacement scenario, you can see that we had a rate of about $1.28 a month, or about a 3% increase in costs for the system. That also translates to about $464 million a year. And if we did it balanced plus with energy policy, the cost goes up to about $500 million a year, or $1.38 a month. And so that basically is what allowed us to come to the conclusion that I mentioned at the top of this presentation, which is that, yeah, we can replace the power from the dams reliably without significantly increasing greenhouse gas emissions. And we can do it at $1.28, $1.38 per month. We can do it at a level that's acceptable to most people in the Northwest. And so at that point, kind of things were happy. And I should note that, that we were criticized somewhat for the study, both by people, obviously, who don't want to give up the dams. And there are also a range of opinions. Some people think our study wasn't adequate, that the cost of replacing the dams could be less than even we determined. And at this point, frankly, we have to say to some degree, we agree, because what we've seen happen in the 2 years since our study was released are a series of things that collectively work to actually improve the picture. First, the cost of renewable resources has come down faster than we anticipated at the time that we did the study. The second thing is that, of course, the Northwest, led by Washington, has in fact started implementing a series of policy measures, including the passage of CETA, which is the Clean Energy Transformation Act, And then also, I think we're all pretty much aware that a lot of coal-fired power plants are going to be retired. We've also since then seen the addition of new transmission resources, or I should say, we've discovered new transmission resources that are available to us that will help us integrate new renewable resources that would replace power from the dams. And then finally, there have been a lot of technological innovations, both with respect to grid management and also on the energy efficiency and grid integration sides of the scale. And so, in aggregate, those changes are working to our advantage and will result, and we'll talk about the degree to which they might actually cause the cost of power replacement to be less than what we were looking at just a moment ago. And so with that, we then turn to the question of, okay, what happened with the DEIS? And the first thing that you have to understand about the DEIS, and the reason, yes, Joseph.
I just wanted to make sure, could you spend just a couple of sentences or a minute or two giving a little bit of background on what the draft EIS is and where it came from,
Sure.
and its timing? Thanks.
Sure. Well, if we go back a couple of years ago, I think many of us are aware that a federal court, Judge Michael Salmon, assessed the job that the federal agencies had done in their previous environmental impact statement of trying to determine what the options were for protecting and restoring fish populations. And at that time, Judge Salmon determined that the federal agencies simply had not done an adequate job of exploring all of the possible options available for helping to restore fish populations. And one of the options that he specifically said the agencies had failed to adequately consider was power replacement, was dam removal and replacing the power elsewhere. And so he issued an order which required the development of a new environmental impact statement. And as part of that environmental impact statement, the agencies were specifically instructed to look at a dam removal scenario, which in fact they did. And that is contained in the document that was released, golly, I'm going back now, I believe it was in March that the actual, or February rather, that the new draft DEIS came out, and we had about a month to comment, to assess and comment on the DEIS. And when we got into it, and when I say we, I'm referring to people way smarter than I am, the technical analysts, including the folks from Energy Strategies who did our original study, we made some rather disturbing discoveries. While the DEIS did in fact conclude that the power from the dams can be replaced at a in a way that preserves reliability, the cost at which they decided that it could be done was much higher than what we had expected and what we would have hoped for. But more to the point, the thing that really disturbed us when we looked at what had been done in the DEIS was the methodology they used to come to those conclusions. And the best way in which I can summarize it is that utilities in the region have to meet certain standards when they do resource planning, when they figure out where are we going to get our power from and how much of it are we going to get. And so utilities like Puget Sound Energy, Portland General Electric, Idaho Power, Northwestern Energy, all of them are required to put together periodically resource plans and have them approved by the relevant state utility commissions. And to do that, there are standards that they have to meet, standards for the level of analysis and exploration of options. And to put it quite simply, the analysis that was done by the federal agencies did not come close to meeting those standards of thoroughness for examining options and testing the alternative solutions that are available. And it's also disappointing to us because back in 2017, the Northwest Energy Coalition and our partner, the Idaho Conservation League, had actually sent a document to the federal agencies about what then would be the upcoming environmental impact statement. And we specifically recommended that they do meet those standards, and we even gave them a roadmap in terms of how to go about doing it. And it included a series of measures such as making sure that when you assess energy needs, you do it over a multi-year time span, that you adequately assess a full range of options, wind, solar, storage, and customer-side resources, and that when you do put together possible combinations or possible options for addressing energy replacement, that you look at different combinations because different resources have different characteristics. And so it's possible not just to look at, it's not an either or, one or the other, but rather oftentimes the best solution is one that combines the strengths of many resources. And quite simply, the agencies failed to do any of those things. What they did was go out and they identified one major resource, solar, as the only generating resource that they would consider for this study. And because, as they often say, the sun doesn't always shine, they also added to it a whole bunch of storage capability. And they said, that became the scenario. That's how we're going to replace the power from the 4 lower Snake River dams. Now, there are a bunch of problems even with that. The first is that the cost that they used, the unit cost to acquire solar power, is significantly higher than the cost that we're seeing in the marketplace and that many people have identified at this point. For instance, if you look at the chart, you'll see that the DEIS that just came out anticipates that in the year 2022, which is the one that they selected for when they would see the transition happening from power from the dams over to a replacement portfolio, they came up with a cost of $1,425 per kilowatt hour. Now, that compares with our analysis, which shows that the cost, in fact, would be about 16% less than that. And we were verified or validated in that assessment when the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which is a federal agency, they did an assessment and they came out at almost exactly the same place that NWEC did, about 15% less than is assumed in the DEIS. But the other factor that we looked at was the fact that the DEIS assumed a replacement date of 2022, which frankly, we don't think is practical, partly for planning reasons, given everything that has to take place between now and the time that the dams are removed, and also the simple physical act, not just of replacing the dams, but also planning for the replacement and then building and implementing the replacement resources that would take place. We anticipated that that probably won't happen until the year 2026. And that has significance from a cost standpoint because, as you're probably aware, the cost of renewable resources, wind, solar, storage, etc., are still continuing to drop precipitously. And so what we anticipate is that by the year 2026, if that's when the power from the dams was going to be replaced, instead of paying the $14.25 that the DEIS anticipates, the number would be closer to $1,000, or between 25 and 30% less than the cost that the DEIS was anticipating. But that is just the first consequence of the DEIS's failure to adequately study the options available. The second one was that the costs for storage are also inflated. Again, this is a chart that comes directly from the DEIS. You'll notice the last line in the chart, solar co-located with DC coupled battery storage. They anticipated a kilowatt cost of $2,568. Our best guess at this point is that the actual cost for this is closer to $1,700, or again, about a third below the figure that's used in the DEIS. But there are more problems. I had mentioned earlier the demand response and energy efficiency. The DEIS assumes that the use of demand response will be limited to about 600 megawatts, which it says is consistent with council estimates. The problem is that's not true. The council, and I'm quoting from the council now, the council said that it indicates that a minimum of 600 megawatts of demand response resources would be cost effective to develop under all future conditions and scenarios. But beyond that, the council's assessment then identified 4,300 megawatts of regional demand response potential, of which about 1,500, or 2.5 times as much as the DEIS anticipated, would be available at a very affordable cost. And so we're seeing that for all of those resources, both the generating resources, but also the storage and the energy efficiency or demand response resources, the costs were significantly exaggerated to begin with. But then that exaggeration was compounded by another one. And that is the amount of resources that the DEIS assumed would be required to replace power from the dams. And I won't go back, but real quickly, you'll remember that in the Northwest Energy Coalition study, we had to lay out what a variety of different resources, what different portfolios would look like. And we determined for the preferred portfolio that we had, that it would require about 2,500 megawatts worth of resources to replace power from the dams. The DEIS, on the other hand, between solar power and battery storage, says that the requirement is going to be more on the order of 3,700 megawatts, or about 50% more than we determined would be necessary to do it. And so not only is the DEIS exaggerating the unit prices of replacement power, but they're also exaggerating the amount that has to be replaced. And I won't dwell on these, but there are other shortcomings in the study as well, which we can come back to if they come up in the question and answer section. But in conclusion, because of these shortcomings, and because they actually do have a material effect on the costs and the options available to us for replacing power from the dams, the coalition has determined, and we've published this on our website, that we believe another analysis needs to be done that does meet the requirements and the standards associated with integrated resource planning, because if it were to be done, we believe that we would see a significant difference in the prices and a much more actionable plan for reducing or for replacing power from the dams. The qualities that that study would have to have would be that energy capacity needs would be examined over a period of years, not just as a snapshot like the DEIS did, that we would fully explore demand requirements and resource options, meaning the full range of resources that are available to us. And finally, and most importantly, that those options would be tested and optimized, combinations of them would be tested and optimized to find the most effective one. And that is something that we're capable of doing. So with that, that is where we stand today. We hope that a new study can be convened and undertaken, and we're interested in working with the federal agencies, but also the state's governors and the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, hopefully, to figure out how that might be done. So Joseph, that's the presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks a lot, Sean. I will, that was great. A number of questions have come in, some in the Q&A and some on the, I think, the chat box. So I'll give you a minute to catch your breath. I'm going to just share a little bit of information and then we'll turn to the questions. Just so folks know, Northwest Energy Coalition website is northwestenergy.org, and it's full of a lot of energy-related information and reflects the program work of the Northwest Energy Coalition. Save Our Wild Salmon, I bet a lot of people know that website. Since you're here this evening, wildsalmon.org. We've got information there as well. There's some links on the webinar announcement, the webinar page that's visible on our homepage that includes some fact sheets that derived from the 2018 study that Northwest Energy Coalition put out that Sean's talked about. But you all should feel free to reach out to either one of us if you'd like more information, and we'd be happy to follow up. I want to turn, I think, to the questions. I'm just looking at my notes here. And well, one last thing is Save Our Wild Salmon has a draft EIS resource page that we put up a couple of weeks ago that summarizes a lot of what the conversation and comment that was generated in that public comment period following the release of the draft EIS. Once again, that's on our website, DEIS resource page. If you want to look at the comments from a bunch of the tribes, states, nonprofit organizations, and so forth, if you feel like diving into that. Turning to the questions, I think I'm just going to take them in turn, and Sean, as the energy expert, you might be on the hook here for a number of these. The first question it was an anonymous post. It says the following: the cost benefit of removal and restoration and impact versus not having built the dams in the first place, lost electricity over current life of dams, like the alternatives up to this point, etc. Has that analysis been done? If you want to take a stab at that, Sean, that's fine. I might follow with a couple quick comments too.
Well, we have not done a full analysis of those things. The study that we did concentrated very narrowly on the question of dam removal, or not dam removal rather, but power replacement. We did not go into issues associated with the cost of removing the dams, for instance, or the costs of continuing to operate them, or the various other economic factors that are out there. Now, I do know, Joseph, that I think one of your upcoming webinars, you're going to be talking with some folks who have looked at that larger, wider range of issues. But to my knowledge, apart from the attempts that have been made at it in the EISs, I don't know that anybody has done that kind of a comprehensive analysis.
My quick response is, if you're available on June 11th, we're going to have a presentation from Adam Domansky, a PhD economist who's dived deeply into the cost, benefits, and trade-offs of the Lower Snake River dams and their removal recently, including in a response document to the draft EIS. He'll be presenting next Thursday at 11th, 5 to 6. If you can't participate in that, we'll also be recording that and make it available. So that would be an opportunity to learn more and be able to probe him as an expert economist on those questions. I hope that's helpful. We have a question from Gregory Fitz. How do we manage an expansion of electricity demands in the region as we electrify transportation, industry, heating, etc.? Will we need more total electricity? Won't we need more power, not just replacing existing resources? Sean?
Yes, we will. Now, it may not be as much more as you might think, however. One of the things I'd point out is that over the last decade, during which, of course, the Northwest population and economy have grown significantly, we're actually using, thanks to energy efficiency and good demand response policies, we're actually using as a whole less electricity now than we did a decade ago. And right now, the Northwest Power and Conservation Council anticipates that even with the growing requirements that were referred to in the question, as a result of building electrification and transportation electrification, that about 75 to 80% of those new requirements will also be met with more energy efficiency. And demand response. And so the answer is yes, we will in fact need more generating resources to meet the need, but it's not as much more as might be expected. And I'd also point out that the amount that we're talking about is probably on the order of 16,000 megawatts or so. And the Lower Snake River dams represent about 1,000 megawatts. So if you want to think about the dams in the context of that larger challenge, they only represent about a plus or minus of 6% one way or the other. So yes, we're going to have to make changes. We're going to have to implement new resources, but whether the dams are part of that exercise or not is not a major factor.
Thanks, Sean. When you talk about those 16,000 average megawatts that will be needed in the future, and those will be met, I'm assuming, am I correct, through a diversity of resources, part of which includes energy efficiency?
Yeah, and we see that already happening. Just in the past few weeks, for instance, the folks at Pacificor, who are based in Oregon but serve a lot of customers in both Oregon and Washington, they just put out a request for proposals for solar, for wind, and also for storage on the order of 4,000 megawatts that they're looking for. And so that's just an indication of how the region, how utilities in the region will plan to meet the coming need.
Mr. Fitz had another question asking to speak to the role of nuclear power to help this transition away from hydropower, and/or if we remove the Lower Snake River dams, is there a way to expand generation at some of the dams that remain? For example, adding generators at Bonneville, for example, is that possible?
There is some possibility for performance enhancement at the dams that remain. It's limited. You're talking about incremental changes there. With respect to nuclear, the reason nuclear did not make the analysis that we did, and frankly is not likely to make an analysis, is that when you look at it from a cost perspective, the cost of nuclear is significantly higher than the costs. And I'm talking even about, by the way, small modular reactors, the newer reactors that are in development right now, is still significantly higher than the other resources that we talked about. And so just from that standpoint, and then also obviously, there are other concerns about nuclear, some related to waste, some related to safety. But just on a cost basis alone, it was not adequate to meet the requirements that we had for this study.
Thanks, Sean. Bill Sampson has a question. Since the normal and required standards were not used in the DEIS analysis, is there any opportunity to challenge the DEIS in court and have a supplemental draft or a second full new report?
You know, the attorneys are the ones who can answer that question. All that I can tell you, but I expect that they will certainly try. And I can tell you that, again, in pointing out that the folks who did the DEIS failed to meet industry standards for power planning, that's not just a criticism. We're not just taking away style points for them, because we believe we can show quantitatively that their failure to meet those standards actually produced measurable changes or inaccuracies that would have a material effect on the cost of the options that we're looking at. So it's not just a criticism of style, it's an actual criticism of, hey, you ended up with bad numbers here. So I expect they will challenge it in court.
I'll just echo that prediction. Sean, of course, has focused his comments on the energy module of the DEIS, but there was a number of other elements that have been heavily scrutinized by the states of Oregon, Washington, tribes, nonprofit organizations, Earth Justice, on behalf of a lot of Save Our Wild Salmon Coalition members. And I think the assessment I've gotten is it's a target-rich environment. It fails to meet the requirements of the law on a host of areas and fails to address the concerns and ruling of the court from 2016 when the court ruled the last plan illegal. And so I think that litigation is highly likely in the future. I will also add that you know, I'll be brief here. It's a longer topic. You know, I don't think any of the advocates who are working on this set of issues view litigation as the path to solutions. And there's a tremendous need that's begun to be answered by leaders in the region for political leadership to work with folks in the region outside of the court in a collaborative and solutions-oriented way that brings folks together and develops a comprehensive plan for the region that meets the needs of salmon, of orca, of our climate and ratepayers, and fishing and farming communities. So that there's a whole nother sort of set of topics there, which could be the basis of a webinar in and of itself. But I just want to sort of flag that the litigation, there's likely litigation ahead, but a lot of our work and NWEC's work and others is focused on working with folks in the region to find a new way forward from what we've been doing for the last 20 years, which has been illegal, expensive, and insufficient. So there's more to talk about there. There's a comment, an anonymous question about the criticism of our criticism of the DEIS that dams would be removed and power be replaced by 2022. Why is that bad? Don't we want it to happen as soon as possible? Sean, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, sure, we want it to happen as soon as possible, but the reasons are primarily practical. And that is that replacing, not just removing the dams, but replacing the power will take quite a lot of political jockeying to bring about. I think we all know that. It's been a long road even to get this point. But even once a decision is made, there's going to have to be quite a lot of planning done by utilities, by regional authorities, by governors, to figure out how do we get from where we are to whatever that new destination looks like. And then, of course, on top of that, you ultimately have the question of physically removing the dams and physically building all of the replacement resources that are there. And so our estimation is that most of that stuff is probably going to take longer than roughly 24 months. which is what was assumed in the DEIS. But there is the other incentive associated with that. And I realize we're playing this off against, literally the survival of salmon and orca and other things. But the other consideration is, of course, one of cost. And that is, as I said during the presentation, that, the cost of renewable resources is still plunging rapidly right now. And by spacing out the acquisition of those new resources, we can also significantly drive down the cost of replacement. So given that all those organizational considerations that I just enumerated a moment ago, it seems, since we're going to be confronted with those anyway, it's nice that we'll be able to have some benefit derived from them, which will be a reduced cost as a result of going a little slower than the DEIS suggested.
The thing I will add, Sean mentioned it, but I'll emphasize it. There is tremendous urgency today to act. Salmon populations today returning to the Columbia and Snake Rivers are at some of the lowest returns on record. Orca, I think everyone on this call should know that. I mean, there's 72 southern resident orcas that remain today. The chief source of their mortality in recent years has been the lack of sufficient prey, Chinook salmon, of which Columbia Basin used to be and could be again a tremendous source. So there's also urgency around the financial challenges facing Bonneville. They're facing new long-term contracts in the next few years, negotiations to begin in the next few years. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. They're facing real challenges in order to maintain their system and meet their needs and obligations, and having more certainty around the costs for salmon and other expenses that they're responsible for in sooner rather than later would be highly advantageous. So I think there's both biological urgencies here, and there are commercial urgencies and perhaps others as well. But it is a reason. I don't think there's any reason for patience or we need to move ahead quickly. People need to come together, and we need to put the plan together, and we need to act on it. Rob Smith asked, so let me just say we're at an hour. I know Sean has extra time. I apologize that we're going to go over, but hopefully people can stay on and continue the conversation. These are a great set of questions. I'm real happy to see folks' engagement and questions. Rob Smith, Sean is asking how power users have accepted the NWEC analysis, the PUDs, Bonneville, other power interests in the region.
I'll go in reverse order. Bonneville chose not to comment on the study, which is interesting because BPA, like most of the major power planning organizations in the region, were given an advance copy of the study to critique, and many of them did. And in fact, the folks at BPA, their technical people, did come back to us before the study was published with suggestions and recommendations. But BPA did not and has not to this date commented on the study, which actually we consider to be a win of sorts, because I think it's a tacit acknowledgement of the soundness of the methodology. At the same time, sure, there has been criticism of the study, frankly, both from folks who are from various utilities, particularly small public utilities that are highly dependent on BPA and are strong defenders of the dams, who've suggested that the study is inadequate in some ways. And we've also been criticized by some folks who are very strongly supportive of dam removal, because in some cases they believe that the study overstates the cost of dam removal and perhaps overstates the value of the dams to the Northwest energy system. So.
Thanks, Sean. Martha Rost asks a question about, rather than ask, I think you mentioned in your comments asking for a new study rather than simply asking that the study results, the NWEC study results, be accepted as accurate. You want to respond to that?
Sure. Well, I think the NWEC study results should be accepted as accurate, except to the degree that they need to be updated to reflect some of the changes that I had mentioned during the presentation. So yes, we're still very confident in the findings of our study, and we think they should be accepted. That said, the problem is that our study does not address enough of the issues that are out there, because of course we know that in addition to the narrow issue of replacing power from the dams, we also need to understand what another questioner mentioned a little bit earlier, which are like, what are the costs to knock down the dams? What are the benefits associated with doing so? And so our study focused just on one narrow aspect of the problem. There are other aspects of this challenge that still need to be addressed competently. And, we at the Northwest Energy Coalition try pretty hard to stay in our lane and in our area of expertise. And so we're really not the people to be able to do that more comprehensive study, although we can, I think, clearly contribute to it.
The thing I will add a little bit of context. The conversation tonight, of course, is focused on the transition that would be required relating to energy if and when the lower Snake River dams are removed. There are also some other communities and services that are reliant and connected to the lower Snake River dams, primarily irrigation and transportation that are important components of the agricultural communities. Those are also pieces of a transition that need to be accounted for, and there need to be a set of investments, just like we're sort of implying and suggesting here with energy transition. There are going to need to be some other transitions required that I think in the larger scheme of things, given the implications of the project salmon recovery, avoided costs, and other things are affordable and make sense, and we ought to move forward. I will just argue that the place where we need to arrive at as quickly as possible is people working together on figuring out some of those details and elements. What are those investments? What are those projects? And how do we develop that sort of set of that package that can help make this transition and do it in a way where we as smoothly and affordably as possible make these transitions. It was Mike Simpson, Congressman Mike Simpson from Idaho, said everything we do and derive from the lower Snake River in its current state, we can do other ways. Salmon, they just need one thing: they need a river. And that's just a reality that we need to focus in on and act on as quickly as possible. I'm going to continue to another question. I want to, Eleanor, I see that you have your hand raised. I think that as an attendee, you're muted. I do want to encourage you to submit a question on the Q&A. So we can get it through that means. And apologies, I think that's right that we're muted. This is our first webinar, and we're still figuring our way forward. A question, Sean, about the DES cost estimate for power replacement being too high. You also indicated with the NWEC study that the estimates are probably too high as well, given the trends of energy costs since the report was published. Is there a chance there wouldn't be any additional cost in this transition or after the transition?
There's a chance. I wouldn't call it a probability, but yeah, there is a chance. But I mean, again, you have to look at this in the context of, the total BPA operating budget. I mean, we're talking about, for instance, you know, as I said before, we're talking about, even if you accept the numbers in the NWEC study from 2 years ago, which are probably, again, somewhat too high, that represented about a 3% difference in the revenue requirement for BPA. And so we're actually talking about a relatively small band of difference of between 0% and 3%. It is not a major issue one way or the other. And that, to me, I mean, as an energy guy and somebody who's still relatively new to the Northwest, I look at this and my reaction to this is, you know, we're talking about costs plus or minus 3% here, right? And we're going to come out of it with an energy system that's as good as the one we have now or better, that doesn't create any additional problems in the form of emissions. And on the other side of the scale, we've got the survival of entire species. Whoops, excuse me. We've got the survival of entire species on the other side of the scale. So from my perspective, I'm not sure that it matters all that much, frankly.
Thanks, Sean. Debbie Stemp has asked a question. How can this information, and to whom can this information be given to force a new EIS to be generated? I might jump in here and just sort of return to an earlier comment from just a moment ago. I think one of the things that we need to do if we're going to succeed here is get out of this cycle. There are going to need to be new analyses and planning to be done around restoring the Lower Snake River. But I am skeptical and would be concerned about, you know, sort of the proposal to jump back into another long multi-year EIS process. And I'll pivot to the next question from Karen Davis to talk about what we should be doing, in my opinion. Aren't they just stalling and drawing out this process until there are no more salmon to save? All the litigation takes years and we don't have that much time. And I think that has been a strategy that's played out for the last 20 or 25 years. We've spent over $17 billion as ratepayers and regional taxpayers on salmon recovery efforts in the Pacific Northwest and the Columbia Basin over that time period. And we have yet to restore a single one of the 13 populations that's currently listed as endangered and threatened under the Endangered Species Act. This is where we've got to get out of this. We don't have time. We've waited so long to address these problems that there's tremendous urgency to act, and that is where the importance of engaging political leaders in the region to bring people together, to come together themselves and put together that package and that plan to move forward quickly on a strategy that works for salmon, for orca, for communities and our energy system. It's the political leadership that is so essential right now and has been so lacking for so many years. And you know, the good news is that political leadership is emerging. It may not be emerging for us fast enough, but it's emerging. Mike Simpson has stepped forward and Republican congressman out of Idaho and said he's committed to restoring salmon to Idaho. Those are Snake River fish, and doing so in a manner that also supports a sustainable Bonneville Power Administration. Governor Brown in Idaho recently sent a letter to Governor Inslee expressing her interest in partnering with Governor Inslee and others who are willing in the region to develop that plan to restore Snake River salmon, and recognizing that Snake River salmon is restoring the Lower Snake River is the very best option for salmon recovery. Governor Inslee has also taken important steps forward in the last year or so with the Orca Task Force, with the stakeholder process, Lower Snake River stakeholder process and dialogue of the last year, as well as the agencies in Oregon and Washington stepping up and asserting their authority under the Clean Water Act. I don't want to sort of dive into those details because it gets pretty wonky pretty quickly, but the fact is politics are shifting and we have a real opportunity. And I think if there's one thing that sort of a to-do that people can carry away from this conversation and share with others is the importance of contacting the governors of the Pacific Northwest and the senators in the Pacific Northwest and House members too, and pressing them on the critical need for their engagement and leadership. Otherwise, we rely on the federal agencies, which have a 25-year track record, which ain't that impressive.
Joseph,
yeah.
Joseph, excuse me, could I kick in one other thing too, since you're talking about, you know, the role that various political leaders play? We don't have to depend on the federal agencies to do the analysis that's needed. That analysis not only can be done by outsiders, whether consulting firms or other agencies, but they probably should be, because the fact is that, you know, the Bonneville Power Administration, the Corps of Engineers, these are not power planning agencies. They don't do this for a living, and it shows in the work that they did in the DEIS. Frankly, the analysis should be done by people who are experienced and do integrated resource planning for a living. And they're out there. They're out there in consulting firms. They're out there in the region's utilities. And it would be entirely possible to either appoint or hire or convene a group that is competent to do the kind of analysis we need. Doesn't have to be the federal agencies.
Thanks, Sean. Greg Fitz is back. I've always heard that a large amount of power from the Lower Snake River dams gets sold to the wider market outside of the region. Is that true?
It is, but only in the sense that a large portion of the power generated in the Northwest generally gets sold out of the region. What happens with BPA is that all of the power generated from its various assets, which include all of the dams, plus, of course, the Columbia Generating Station, the nuclear facility, all of that power goes into a single pool. And a significant portion of it is, in fact, sold to California, yes. But it's not as though the power from the Snake River dams is sold to California in any greater degree than the power from any other BPA resource.
There used to be, Sean, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, 20 years ago, much more demand for Snake River power in California in the spring, which is when the bulk of that energy is produced. But that market has really dried up because of California's investments in solar and other renewable resources that help fill their own need in those spring months. So I think the power value of the Snake River Dam energy to Bonneville, and that comes back to the region effectively, has dropped considerably in recent years.
Yeah, it has. I mean, what you're talking about is, of course, the price of renewables and the expansion of capacity, particularly solar in California, has reduced their purchases. But more than that, more importantly from a BPA perspective, is that it's reduced the price that they can command for the sale of power out of the region. And so that's part of the economic challenge that BPA faces generally. Yeah.
Two questions have come up from Christine Reed and Alex about dam removal versus breaching, the terminology, and I'll just take a stab at answering that question.
Good.
I think well, the dams have basically three main components. They have an earthen structure, earthen fill to hold the water back. They have the locks that provide for navigation, commercial navigation on barges, and then they've got the built power producing concrete structures where the turbines are. as I understand it, the sort of cheapest and would be a completely adequate pathway forward would be to remove the earthen structure, the mothball and leave the concrete in place and allow the river to move around it. That does a number of things. One is it reduces cost quite a bit, to restore this river, because you don't have to. You can just set aside and basically lock up the built structure. I think the term that many people think of with regards to just removing the earthen structure is breaching. And I think, even though I think a lot of people, including myself, use the terms interchangeably, I might say dam removal. I'm referring to, I think, what's widely accepted as the path forward will be removing the earthen structures. So hopefully that clarified that question a bit. Nina Sarmiento, Sean, is asking about were greenhouse gas emissions from the Lower Snake River Dam reservoirs taken into account? I'm thinking about methane here. I think under the GHG, under the greenhouse gas evaluation of replacement alternatives.
They were not in our study.
Okay, and I don't think that they were referred to in the DEIS either.
I don't believe so.
Yeah. Let's see. We've still got quite a few participants, which is great, and we've got time. Sean, let me know if you have to leave, but we'll continue with these questions. Cindy Flanagan, how can the Elwha dam removal costs and technique help inform the cost-benefit removal of Lower Snake River dams? And are there other dam removals that can be used as case studies?
You don't expect me to answer that, do you?
I won't try to get into the sort of costs and techniques, but I think that the result has been as a consequence of restoring the Elwha River, removing 2 dams that were privately owned and in place for almost a century out on the Olympic Peninsula near Port Angeles, is a unparalleled success story. The ecosystem is restoring itself. The salmon and steelhead and other fish populations are coming back. Wildlife are returning. In the case of the Elwha River, which connects directly to the ocean, the estuary is healing. All of this sediment that had been backed up for 100 years is now been pushed out into the estuary area. I heard yesterday Dungeness crab have come back to that area after having been gone for decades. I think that there is a story there, and backed and supported by science and our real world experience, that when we restore rivers, when we remove dams and allow rivers to flow again, that these natural systems know how to fix themselves and fish come back. In my experience in the Northwest, and there's been, at least a dozen dam removals over the last 20 years, the salmon and steelhead populations return, and they return more quickly and in higher numbers than even the scientists predicted. And so I do think there's a lot of value. There might be more technical information that I'm not aware of that can help inform how we move forward. I know that all these rivers and dams are unique and need to be sort of considered on their own. The approach that they used on the White Salmon River is different than what they used on the Elwha, and it's different than what they're going to use on the Klamath, where 4 private dams on the border of California and Oregon are slated for removal in the next 12 to 24 months. But I do think that there's a story that's been, that has been reinforced in not just in the Northwest, but in the East Coast too. When we restore rivers, these systems heal themselves, and they do so quickly. Let's see. I'm going to shift if I could. Well, I'm going to give you one question, Sean. I see the initials RPS, and I figure that's a question for you. Pat Brewer has a question. Given California's recent RPS transition, disallowing imported RECs from counting as renewable? Have you seen more support for dam removal from regional stakeholders? Do you expect the political attitudes to shift as export prices drop?
The answer is yes, we do. Yes, we've seen, I think, more support generally, certainly more openness on the part of utilities to at least talk about this issue, which I think, by the way, is reflected in an effort that Joseph is a leader of, bringing in utilities and other organizational leaders to, in their letter to the 4 governors of the Northwest states, to really come together for a dialogue on this issue and in a search for solutions. So yes, that's happening. Real quickly, the acronyms that were mentioned in there, RPS refers to Renewable Portfolio Standard. And what that means is simply that California, like Washington, has laws that require utilities to get a certain amount of the energy that they provide from renewable resources like wind and solar. And of course, those requirements have been increasing and have been a driver of the boom in solar power and other renewable energy that we were talking about just a moment ago. The questioner also asked about RECs, which are renewable energy credits. And that is sometimes when utilities have to meet a certain standard for the amount of energy that they acquire from renewable resources, sometimes they physically can't meet the requirement because they don't own the resources or they don't have access to clean resources. So in that case, they're able to purchase credits from other utilities effectively that result in a net reduction or a net meeting of the standard rather than necessarily each utility physically meeting the standard. So it's a way of, it's basically a bookkeeping method of allowing utilities to meet requirements that they can't meet physically by other means available to them, so that if they're not meeting them, there's some other utility someplace else that's exceeding the requirement, so that in net, on balance, we are achieving whatever goal happens to have been set forth.
Thanks, Sean. More questions are coming in, and people are holding on, hanging on. So we'll keep going. A question from Jan. Sean, can you talk about the additional new transmission resources that you referred to in the talk?
Sure. There are 2 kinds that are out there. First is, I think everyone's familiar with the fact that a lot of coal-fired power plants are retiring in the region. And that process is already well underway. And so, for instance, in Centralia, Washington, where we have the largest coal-fired power plant in the state, which will be retired by 2025, there are naturally transmission lines coming out of Centralia, which are going to be used by a new 150 megawatt solar array that's going in there. And so similarly in Colstrip, Montana, where there's a major coal-fired power plant from which we get a lot of our energy, it's one of the largest coal-fired power plants in the country, it is already beginning to retire units there as well. And there are, of course, major transmission lines from eastern Montana to Seattle and Portland. And that's significant because eastern Montana happens to be a region of the country that is either, depending on how you measure these things, either the most or the second most rich resource for wind generation in the country. And so those power lines that are going to fall into non-use or partial non-use as the Colstrip coal plant shuts down gradually will become available for the use of wind power coming out of Montana. The other form of new transmission resource that we found is that, of course, existing transmission resources, including those from the lower Snake River region from the dams that are served there could be repurposed and used for other new forms or new renewable energy that could be developed in that region as well. And BPA, which controls about 3/4 of all the transmission capacity in the Northwest, has actually made great strides over the past couple of years, not only in looking at opportunities for repurposing these assets that are going to be underutilized as coal shuts down, but they've also had an initiative to make more efficient use of existing resources, which has been quite successful. And so when you go back to when we released our study, there are significantly more transmission resources available to the region now than we thought there were at the time that we completed our study.
Thanks, Sean. Shifting gears, a question from Scott Maxwell. Is it true that some of the flooded areas below these dams, underneath the reservoirs, actually belong to Native Americans by treaty with the US government? I'll take a stab at answering that question. And I guess I'll start by saying that we are in touch with a couple of tribal leaders right now in the Northwest to see if we could host a webinar with them at the sort of center of the discussion for the 25th of June. So that would be a great webinar to attend and ask this question and get I'm sure a more accurate and a different answer than I can give. I think what I'll just simply say here is that there's 14,000 acres of land underneath the 4 reservoirs on the lower Snake River that will be restored when the dams are removed. And absolutely, all of that land historically was used and inhabited by tribal people who've been here since time immemorial. There were village sites. There were I'm sure sort of hunting and gathering sites, and there were sacred sites. I'm sure the whole diversity of different cultural uses by the tribes. When the dams, one of the things that needs to occur in the planning process is going to be, in my mind, stated humbly, is full engagement and partnership with the historic inhabitants of these lands, and careful consideration about what that management looks like and how it's managed and who manages it. So there's a conversation again right there in and of itself that's a very important one and one that needs to occur, and I think in some ways, in some quiet ways, has begun in some communities. But much more on that. Again, that'll be a great question for the conversation on the 25th, I think it is, if we're able to pull that together. Let's see, other questions. We're about 30 minutes over, but again, I appreciate everyone who's stuck around. Let's see, a question from Vicky Simones, I think. Is it true that the Federal Corps of Engineers, the Army Corps of Engineers, is also an obstacle to dam removal? And I'll just tell you, my perspective is absolutely. This is an old, large federal agency that its mission has been to build dams for the various purposes they have, and they've not been very good at recognizing dams have a lifetime, and that the public opinion shifts and cost benefit analyses change and context changes and public opinion and interest change. I think the Army Corps of Engineers has been an undying advocate for the status quo and for preserving these projects in some ways, regardless of the cost that they impose on salmon and on communities, tribal and non-tribal, despite the fact that the agency, has a many $billion in project backlogs, huge shortfalls in funding, and projects that are increasingly at risk. It wasn't an Army Corps of Engineer dam, but we all saw what happened in Michigan recently when the dams failed and communities were flooded and people had to evacuate. Increasingly, there are many federal projects around the country that are facing those kinds of risks. And we either, there was a great report that came out 15 or 20 years ago, which was, invest, divest, or decommission. And it was talking about the fact that the Army Corps of Engineers is woefully underfunded to maintain all the projects they've built over the years. But these are big agencies, and they're difficult to change, and that's certainly been an obstacle in this conversation. Okay, well, maybe I'll find one more question, and then Sean, give you a couple of moments to a couple concluding remarks, and we'll adjourn. A message from Jan. I heard a talk in Moscow, Idaho, that the lower Snake River dams are run-of-river dams and do not require major demolition like the Elwha, but could simply be opened up, and presumably infrastructure could be removed. Is this correct? Perhaps I didn't understand correctly. Do you want to take a stab at that?
You're talking to me.
Okay.
I only know, this is non-expert stuff, I only know that they are in fact run-of-the-river dams. However, I don't know exactly what the implications of that are for how they should be removed or modified and what options that creates.
They are run-of-the-river dams, which means they don't store water for irrigation or other purposes, but they, the water that flows in at the top of the system is sort of basically what flows out at the bottom of the system in real time. There's some slight modifications around that, but as opposed to the Elwha Dam, which was 125 foot tall and required major demolition. Breaching the earthen structures of the lower Snake River dams, that's one piece of this transition that would be required. But as we've been talking about on the energy front, as well as on waterfront property and communities in like Clarkston and Lewiston are going to need a plan and transitions. So a plan to redevelop their waterfront, which really is an opportunity in many ways in this transition. And then also, of course, thinking about there are some irrigation infrastructure that draws water from the Ice Harbor Reservoir, the lowest of the 4 reservoirs, and the the original reason that these dams were conceived of many decades ago was for the barge transportation, water navigation, and today, while that's declined a lot, there's still some of that occurs, and there needs to be a plan to make sure that the wheat and other products that are on the river can travel through alternative means. I think primarily rail, and again, those conversations I think have occurred and continue to occur, and there's options there.
Joseph, if I could, I would just add one thing having to do with the fact that these are run-of-the-river dams. It's an implication for the energy system, and that is that dams that are capable of storing water can be used like batteries in the energy system, because you can store up water, and then when you need it, when you need more power because there's a lot of demand or because other resources are running low, you can release that water to drive your turbines and generate more electricity. And that's true of a lot of the Columbia River System dams. They can do that. It's just not true of the 4 lower Snake River dams. So in that respect, the lower Snake River dams are somewhat less flexible and less valuable than other dams from a power system perspective.
We have one more question that got inadvertently overlooked. Terry Wright asking if we have any thoughts. I think I know the answer to your question, Terry, very briefly. Do we have any thoughts on how the recent tweaks to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, specifically Wheeler's changes to section, I think that's Department of Ecology Director Wheeler's, if I'm not mistaken, changes to section 401, but I might be mistaken in that regard. And Trump signing an executive order that waives the need for environmental review will impact Lower Snake River, this conversation around Lower Snake River dams. And Terry, we should follow up separately. The short answer from my perspective is, well, there have been a number of recent developments in the region with the EPA relating to the pressing need to regulate water temperature, a form of pollution caused by the dams and reservoirs on the Lower Snake and Lower Columbia River dams. And that's been, significant policy and regulatory developments in the last several months, which I think have, provide very strong sort of leverage or pressure on the status quo, on the current status quo. And so I think that there's a process that we are embarking on now as a region to begin to address that question. But and that's going to take a while. But the fact that it's begun to roll and has been finally acknowledged after many years of basically being ignored is, I think, a very substantial development. And I think the folks that brought the litigation and succeeded at it, Columbia Riverkeeper, Advocates for the West, and some other organizations deserve a lot of credit for helping to highlight this critical issue that needs to be addressed. I can't speak to the issue beyond that. I'm not a lawyer, and it gets highly technical really quickly. But there's more to talk about on that particular issue. I think with that, I just wanted, for everyone who's still on and listening in, thank you so much for participating. It's really amazing set of questions, and I hope that the discussion was as satisfying for you all as it was for me. Sean, I want to give you a couple minutes to say a few concluding remarks, and then thank you. And
well, I would just like to thank you, Joseph, for the opportunity to do this. We frankly don't get that many chances to talk about the study and the implications for dam removal in this much detail. So it's great to be able to do this. The other thing I'd like to offer for anybody who's still on, if you have questions or want to go deeper into some of the issues that we've talked about today, please don't hesitate to email me. My email address is just my first name, Sean, SEAN, at NWEnergy.org. And please don't hesitate to reach out. So thank you.
Sean, thanks so much for spending your evening with us. I thought you did an excellent job. The questions that came in were incredibly thoughtful and supported a really wonderful discussion. I will close by encouraging people to join, if they can, the upcoming webinar events later this month. You can check out our website for updates. I will also issue a reminder around the need for the political leadership. It's emerging. It's not emerging more quickly enough, and I can't tell you how important individual and persistent contacts with our members of Congress in the Northwest states and our governors is at this time. So visit our website for more information. Reached out to us to get more involved. Thanks so much for participating and spending your evening with us, and we'll hopefully you'll see you in a week. Take good care. Good night.